or money or votes or ideas or guns to make things the way we want them to be, regardless of what other people want. And the logic of forcing is that it is in some ways, or from some perspectives, actually the simplest and most natural thing to do. I'm not happy with the situation. I have the capacity to change the situation, so I'm going to act to change the situation to be the way I want it to be. And sometimes this works. I would argue that for many people, maybe not everybody, but for many people, forcing is the default mode. They may do it in a very polite way, they may do it in a very careful way, but the bottom line is they're not happy with the situation, they have the capacity to make it the way they want it to be, and so they're going to use that capacity to do so. The limitation of forcing is the obvious one. I push to make it the way I want it to be. If you disagree, you push back, and the result is that we get stuck. The second option is adapting. We're not happy with the situation. We don't have the capacity to make it the way we want it to be, so we find a way to live with it as it is. Adaptation has a very clear logic. Actually, most things in the world we can't do anything about, so we find a way to live with them as it is. When it's cold outside and I walk out of my hotel room, I can't change that. It's not within my power to change it, so I adapt. I go back and I get on a heavier coat. The limitation of adapting is that sometimes what is happening around us is unbearable and unacceptable, as it was for the Mexicans. They found the situation unacceptable. They weren't willing to simply live with it as it was. The third option is exiting, or again, I think maybe a more interesting word that we've been talking about these last few days is escaping. So we're not happy with the way things are. We can't make it the way we want it to be. We're not willing to live with it as it is, and so we exit or escape. Maybe we quit our job, maybe we get a divorce, maybe we emigrate, or maybe we just tune out and pretend that it's not happening. The logic of exiting is that we can liberate ourselves, we can escape from this situation which is unacceptable to us. The limitation of exiting is often this liberation is tragic. And what I'm arguing is that we can only understand collaborating clearly when we understand that it is only one option of four. We can't make things, we're not happy with the way things are. We can't make it the way we want it to be. We're not willing to live with it as it is. We're not willing to exit, and therefore we have to find a way to work with others to change the situation. The logic of collaborating is that we think it's our best choice. Maybe it's our first choice, maybe it's our last resort, maybe we make this choice to collaborate through rationality or through intuition or through preference. The limitation of collaborating is that maybe it will not succeed. So, let's say we've decided to try to collaborate. We're faced with a situation that we are not happy with. We don't think we can force it. We're not willing to adapt or exit. We need to try to collaborate. And so my second question is, in such circumstances, what does it take to succeed? Collaboration is walking along a road as a team with clear agreements on where we need to end up and what we need to do to get there. And there's a clear recipe for collaboration. The recipe is, first of all, focus on the good of the whole. Secondly, focus on agreeing what is the problem, what is the solution, what is the plan. And thirdly, focus on what people need to do. Is this correct? This means yes, this means no. Is this correct? Is this correct? No, it is not correct. It is not correct. This was a trick question. The limitation of this conventional approach to collaboration is that it only works in situations that are simple and harmonious and stable. No? It's fine. In situations that are complex and conflictual and out of control, we cannot get such agreements. And even when we can get them, they do not hold. In such situations, this conventional recipe for collaboration does not and indeed cannot work. In such situations, this conventional recipe is dangerously inadequate. So the basic argument I'm making is that what we need to understand is that if we want to succeed in collaborating in complex and conflictual situations, we need to actually turn this conventional approach to collaboration on its head. We have to abandon the fantasy that we can get things to be agreed and under control, and in fact we have to do the opposite of what is conventional and habitual. I call this unconventional and uncomfortable approach to collaboration stretch collaboration, because it requires us to stretch out of our comfort zone. So unlike the image of a team of people walking down a road, stretch collaboration is rafting along a wild river in different boats, figuring out what we have to do as we go along, realizing that in the end, the only thing we can change is what we ourselves are doing. And the promise of stretch collaboration is it may be unconventional and uncomfortable, and in some ways exactly the opposite of our habitual approach, but the promise is that it enables us to deal with complex and conflictual situations and to work not only with friends and colleagues, to succeed not only in working with friends and colleagues, but also with strangers and opponents. A stretch collaboration involves stretching in three ways. The first stretch is stretching in how we relate to the people we're collaborating with. In conventional collaboration, we often hear people say sanctimoniously, we need to focus on the good of the whole. You ever heard anybody say that? We need to focus on the good of Japan, or the good of Toyota, or the good of the team. We need to focus on the good of the whole. But actually, the problem with the statement that we need to focus on the good of the whole is there is never only one whole. And usually when somebody says we need to focus on the good of the whole, what they're really trying to say is we need to focus on the whole that matters to me. There are always multiple wholes, multiple hold-ons, wholes that are part of larger wholes. And in complex and conflictual situations, we cannot control how different actors understand what is happening and what should happen. Differences in perspectives and interests and positions of the actors are inevitable. They cannot be avoided, which means we need to enable fighting as well as engaging, working with conflict as well as connection, as one of you said, working with power as well as with love. And the example I will give you of this is this work with President Santos that Riichiro alluded to. In 1996, I worked with Juan Manuel Santos, of course long before he was President of Colombia, on a series of workshops that were called Destination Colombia, which brought together all of the parties to the armed conflict, the two guerrilla groups, the paramilitary, cabinet ministers, NGO leaders, trade unionists, etc. And 20 years later, President Santos succeeded in negotiating a peace treaty that ended these 52 years of civil war. This was the moment of the agreement of the peace treaty, and in 2016 he won the Nobel Peace Prize for this. And on the day that the Peace Prize was announced, he was now President of Colombia, and the website of his website referred to these workshops 20 years before as one of the most significant events in Colombia's search for peace. Now, of course, I was thrilled to read this. The first thing I did was ask the Rios web person to make a link to the presidential website. This was good, but the truth is I didn't understand why he said this. I didn't understand why President Santos kept referring to these workshops 20 years before. So many other things that happened over these 20 years. There had been many United Nations missions. There have been enormous military operations. He himself had been Minister of Defense. There have been 5 years of negotiations in Havana. Why did he keep referring to these workshops? And last year I was in Bogota, and I had the privilege of interviewing President Santos in a conference like this, and this was the question I wanted to ask him. I said, President Santos, why do you keep referring to these workshops 20 years ago? And he had a very interesting answer. Actually, it's a better answer. It's a better summary of the book than is in the book. Unfortunately, the book was already published. But he said the following. He said, "What I learned in Destination Colombia is that contrary to all of my political upbringing, it is possible to work with people you do not agree with and will never agree with." Now, this is a very interesting formulation. Most of the time when we think about working with people different than us, we think, well, we'll meet, we'll have a beer together, we'll talk, and we'll find it was all just a misunderstanding, and actually we agree. But he's raising the bar. He's saying it's possible to work with people with whom we have a permanent disagreement. By the way, the other question I asked him in this interview is I asked him, President Santos, what for you personally was the most difficult part of achieving this treaty with the guerrillas? And he said, the most difficult part for me was being considered a traitor. And it's true, by the time he left office a month ago, he had been destroyed politically. So the idea that collaborating with the enemy always has a happy end for the person doing the collaborating is not true. So the first stretch is the following: stretching from focusing only on the good and harmony of the whole to embracing not only connection but also conflict. But this working with conflict as well as connection is a stretch, especially for people like me who want things to be harmonious and under control. We might want things to be like this, but usually they aren't. The second stretch involves how we make our way forward in the collaboration. In conventional collaboration, we often hear people say impatiently, we need to agree on what we will do. But actually, in such situations, usually we cannot agree. In fact, we can't even know what we need to do. In complex and conflictual situations, we can't control how the work will unfold. We don't know what will work and what won't work. We need to experiment. And there's a very interesting image of this, a famous image from Deng Xiaoping, who was describing the national transition in China to a socialist market economy. And the phrase he's famous for having used is, "We are crossing the river feeling for stones." And this image of crossing the river feeling for stones is really the opposite of this image of, we know exactly where we're going, we have a plan, we're just executing a pre-established plan. So the second stretch is from insisting that we agree on the problem, the solution, and the plan, to realizing that we need to feel our way forward. But this feeling our way forward is a stretch, especially for people like me who want things to be predictable and under control. We might want things to be like this, but usually they aren't. The third and most fundamental stretch involves how we ourselves are involved in the process of collaboration. In conventional collaboration, we often hear people say, very seriously, for the situation to change, people must change. But what they almost always mean by that is other people must change. The problem with this is actually we cannot get anyone to do anything. In complex and conflictual situations, we cannot control what other people do. It's a very interesting experience writing a book because you're always thinking about it during those months or years. And I had this experience when I was finishing this book. I realized that I could easily spend several hours every day thinking about what other people ought to be doing, thinking about what my colleagues ought to be doing, what my damn clients ought to be doing, what my kids ought to be doing, what Mr. Trump ought to be doing. And in a way, it's a very soothing way to spend the time. It's all about what those other people ought to be doing. And what I realized was, it really is in the end a completely useless way to spend the time. That what's required sooner rather than later is to say, yes, that may all be true, but what am I going to do next? And stretch collaboration involves shifting how we understand our role in the situation from thinking of ourselves as outside the situation, as directors or observers of the situation, to understanding ourselves to be inside or part of, as a co-responsible co-creator. There used to be a slogan, a well-known phrase in English, that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. But the more important point is that if you're not part of the problem, if you can't see how what you're doing is a part of what is happening, then it follows logically that there's nothing you can do to be part of the solution except from above by forcing. And so the third and most fundamental stretch is to stretch from trying to change what other people are doing to recognizing that we are part of the game and have to be willing to change ourselves. This accepting our role as co-responsible co-creators is a stretch, especially for people like me who prefer to be in authority and in control. We might want things to be like this, but usually they aren't. So, to conclude, I think more and more that we're living in a time that presents us with really tough challenges. Many of the things we have thought were stable, our culture, our politics, our economy, our climate, are not stable. And this instability is, on the one hand, terrifying, and at the same time, it's hopeful because it means we have an opportunity, or we hope we have an opportunity, to make a difference. These tough challenges require us to collaborate, but to do so in actually a radically unconventional way. And what it requires us is to abandon our fantasies, our delusions of agreement and harmony and certainty and authority and control. We need to stretch, or to put it another way, we need to relax into a less rigid and more realistic approach to collaboration. And when we do this, when we are stretching, the people we think of as our opponents or enemies help us become aware of our rigidities and to relax. And in this sense, our enemies can become our teachers. My experience has taught me that this stretching is necessary, and it's difficult, and it's possible. I'm committed to stretching so that I can contribute to addressing the tough challenges of our time, and I invite you to join me. Domo arigato.
はい、アダムさんありがとうございました。Q&A に行く前にですね、少し自分の考えみたいなことをですね、ちょっとまとめてみる、言語化してみるような時間を少し、取ってみたいと思います。